Hi everyone! This week I want to do a little video about sourdough starters. Well, in particular my sourdough starter and how I keep it, because my method's a bit unusual. Not that many people use it. I think it's a really simple and easy method that allows you to make bread whenever you want to. The basic method behind the way that I manage my starter is that I keep it in the fridge. Part of that is that I live in a hot climate for most of the year. It's a subtropical area where I live. So, keeping a sourdough starter out on the bench and feeding it all the time is just not feasible. It takes too much work and wastes too much flour, and it would be starving all the time in this weather. So I use the fridge, but I use the fridge in a really particular way. So when I make my bread, all I do is I take my starter out of the fridge and I use that starter cold in the bread. So I tip it out, I mix some into my bread, and I leave just a little bit left in the jar, and then I feed that up, and then once that activates, I usually just leave it to go alongside the bread. Once that activates, it goes back in the fridge, and then it stays there until the next loaf. Now, a lot of people say, but shouldn't you feed your starter before you bake with it? Wouldn't it be better if you had a fresh starter? Well, yes, probably. It's probably ideal to have your starter fresh and maybe use a levain type method where you create a starter for the particular loaf that you're making. But for me, I am quite a minimalist, and I'm becoming more and more that way as my life progresses. And I really love both the convenience, and there's a real joy for me too in the ability to be really spontaneous with your bread making. I love nothing more than to get up one Sunday morning and not have any plans to make bread, but go, I feel like mixing up a whatever loaf, and I just take my starter out of the fridge and I mix up my loaf, and I'm done. So I don't have to be pre-planning everything all the time. I don't have to use so much mental energy to maintain my sourdough bread making. And I have been using this starter, Dear Boris, it's 12 years old this year. I have been using this method, this really simple method, and making really, pretty decent home-baked sourdough loaves for all that time. So it works. The main thing is you want to use your starter within about a week. You can let it go longer and it will still make fine bread, but I think if you let it go for too long, it does get very hungry, and the yeasts that are held in the culture, they do start to die off. So the starter won't be as strong if you've left it in the fridge for 2 or 3 weeks and you go to make a loaf of bread. Yeah, you can still make a loaf of bread, but it won't be the strongest, healthiest starter. But up to a week, up to 5 days, up to 7 days, it works fine for me. So I encourage you, if that approach appeals to you, give it a try, because it can be really quite freeing, and I just love that. You might be wondering about quantities. I use about 120, 130 grams of starter per loaf, which is kind of almost all of this container. And what I do is, for my loaf, I just tip out most of it. You've probably seen that in some of my videos. I leave just a little bit behind, and then I feed this up with about 60, 70 grams each of whole wheat flour. In my case, you could use rye, you can use any flour you like really. Whole wheat flour and water. So that's it. I just want to say something about the rising of the starter. I know that a lot of beginners with sourdough bread making, they get very worried about whether or not their starter is alive and whether it's active or not, because it hasn't risen or it doesn't look like it's risen enough or whatever. So the thing to know with sourdough starters rising is that a thick starter will rise. It's like it's got enough body and enough kind of strength and structure in it because it's dry, that when the starter, when the yeast and lactic acid bacteria start to consume the carbohydrates in the flour and they produce carbon dioxide, which is what makes your bread and your starter rise, when they rise up in a firm starter, there's enough strength in the actual material of the starter because it's thick, for that to push up as the gas fills the culture. If your starter is runny, there's not enough body, so the bubbles, the carbon dioxide gas, floats to the top. And usually if your starter is a little bit on the thin side, which is perfectly okay, you just got to adjust the water level in your bread recipe if you're going to use a thin starter. So, you know, thin starters become frothy. They don't rise in the jar at all, not much anyway. They just get all these tiny, 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 weeny little frothy bubbles, which is awesome. They get super active, but they're just not going to rise up. So don't get too worried about whether or not your starter is rising. What you're looking for is activity. So if it's a thick starter, you will see big bubbles, big holes, and a really thick starter will rise up really well and you'll see big chunky holes. A really thin runny starter, it's not going to rise, but it's going to be really frothy. So you want to look for those frothy, tiny little bubbles. That's what you look out for. While I'm here, I also want to talk a little bit about containers for your sourdough starter. Most people use glass, and I use these Weck jars, which have become really, really popular in the sourdough world. I've been using them for years. They're great. The reason that these are so good is that they're a really tough glass. They're very thick and robust, but they're not so big that you can't just fit them in the door of your fridge. And they have straight sides. So the straight sides make it really easy to scrape down the sides of your container. So after you mix up your starter, scraping down the sides is really good to do. I haven't actually washed this jar in, I don't know how long. It's at least a year, if not more. I probably should wash it. But every time I mix my starter, I mix it up. I just use a spoon like this, mix it up, and then once it's all mixed, I just get a silicone spoon like this. They're great if you've got one, and I just dampen it and I scrape down the sides so there's very little residue left on the sides. That will really prevent any mold or anything else growing yucky in your jar. And you know, once your starter has risen up a bit, you can put it back in the fridge, so that's going to really help prevent spoilage too. Back to containers. You don't need a special jar for your starter. You can use a coffee cup. A coffee mug is perfect. This is just an old mug. It's got straight sides. Yes, you can't see your starter through it rising up, but you can look in and see that if it's doing what it's meant to be doing, and see when it's, ready to bake with or ready to go back in the fridge, or however you manage it. I've got these little plates. They make really good lids for coffee cups, and in some kind of cheapy shops, I buy these in Daiso for a couple of dollars. These little silicone mug covers, that kind of thing is fine too. So just use what you've got. You don't have to have special equipment to do your bread. It's easy. A final word on containers. Don't be afraid of plastic. Polypropylene plastic, which is the number 5 type plastic, which all of our food containers, takeaway food containers, all sorts of containers, microwave cooking containers, anything that's polypropylene number 5 is actually pretty stable and pretty safe. I don't see any issue at all with storing your sourdough starter in a plastic container. I think that's all I want to say, really. Just wanted to introduce this idea of keeping it really simple if you want to. If you've got time and you would like to build a levain and use other methods to build a starter before you make your bread, all power to you. I think that's great and you're going to get great results. But if you're like me and you just want to keep things really simple and give yourself the freedom to make your bread really spontaneously, then you can use the fridge method. Just take your starter out, use it straight away, use it cold, it's fine. Thanks everyone, I hope that was helpful. Please let me know if you've got any questions in the comments below, and I'll see you again soon.